The country's economy contracted by 0.1 percentage points in the first quarter between January to March of this year. 6 of the 10 industries on the production side of the economy performed poorly, with manufacturing being the largest negative contributor, declining by 1.4%. Now, the gross domestic product data, that's a GDP, for quarter one of this year was released by Stats SA yesterday. It also showed that household final consumption expenditure also decreased in the first quarter. Consumers cut back on spending, particularly on clothing and footwear, transport, alcoholic beverages, tobacco and recreation, as well as culture. To give us more insight on the growth domestic product figures, we are joined by Joe de Beer. He's the Deputy Director General of Economic Statistics at Stats SA. Joe, it's good to have you. Thank you very, very much for joining us on the program.
Good morning. Thanks for the invite.
So let's, I suppose, start with the basics for those that sort of listen to these numbers and how they all work. How is it, or how is the GDP used to measure how our economy is doing?
The GDP tries to summarize all economic activity into a single number. So it's quite a complex exercise, but we can maybe boil it down to say that we try to estimate what value is added with each economic transaction. And if I take a simple example, if I'm a manufacturer of wooden chairs, I could argue that I buy wood for 100 Rand, I transform the wood into a chair, sell it for 150 Rand. So I added that differential, the 50 Rand is what I added back to the economy. Out of that 50, I obviously pay wages, makes a profit, but in essence, that is the primary principle behind measuring the GDP.
And the primary finding is that we're in a little bit of trouble with the GDP because we've been waiting for growth for a very long time. And in terms of where we're sitting with this 0.1% weaker economy, was this expected?
Expectations differed between analysts. Many of them thought the economy would be stagnant. We saw some expectations of, on the upside, maybe a positive 0.2. Here and there, somebody thought we might contract, but this estimate is generally in the ballpark figure, although it is still disappointing for everybody.
Yeah, it certainly is. But what do we attribute it to? I mean, we're going to go into each of the sectors separately, but overall, is it load shedding? Because I know with the relief to load shedding, looking forward, this is hopefully going to see a bit of growth, which is quite an optimistic way forward because we haven't had load shedding in quite some time now. But when we look back, what was hanging over this to make the figures not so good?
I think if we take a bit of a longer-term view and we go back from the recovery after COVID, the economy has always struggled to grow much more than about a 0.2 on average. Even last year, our economic growth for the year was 0.7, which gives you roughly 0.2 per quarter if you just did a crude average. So the contraction for this quarter is not that far off of the behavior that we've seen in the last few years. You mentioned the load shedding, and we might have become used to no load shedding. I think it's around 10 weeks now that we haven't had load shedding. But this period that we're reporting on now is from 1 January to 31 March, and there was still severe load shedding during that period. So it definitely played a role. Other macroeconomic events, we're still in a country that has relatively high interest rates for various good reasons, but that obviously places a strain on the final demand from households, investment decisions. It might be that some investment decisions were slightly delayed because of the upcoming elections at the time that the survey was done. So I think it's a bit of a culmination of many different factors. The only highlight really from the statistics we released was the performance of the agriculture sector.
Yeah, all right. So let's have a look at that and talk a little bit more about some of the highlights and the lowlights. So that agricultural sector you referred to performed better than most sectors in this first quarter, expanding by 13.5%. Why? What contributed to this? And what about, I suppose, fruit and vegetable import and export sectors?
I think there's a couple of things to keep in mind with agriculture. The first is that it came from a a very subdued growth, if not a contraction in the fourth quarter. So there's a bit of a base effect, which basically just means that if you have a negative number, then the next quarter is very likely to be a high positive if the weather conditions played along. Now, in the case of the horticulture industry, some analysts might have been concerned about the adverse weather conditions we saw with drought. But remember that the fruit and the veg, a big portion of that is under irrigation. So it's not affected as much as what maize would potentially be with adverse weather conditions. We'll probably see the impact of the weather in the next quarter for agriculture when we start factoring in the harvesting of the maize crops. The second factor was concerns about the availability of the transport infrastructure. Now, that would impact on agriculture. But what we've seen was the cooperation between government and many of the private sector firms ensure that we could still be in a position to export all of the fruit and veg. And we actually had a trade surplus if we compare the exports of fruit and veg with the imports that we had.
So when we look at household consumption, because this is now we're talking directly to people that are sitting and watching this show, household expenditure decreased in this first quarter. Consumers, what the numbers are saying, cut back on clothing, they cut back on transport. That's obviously also the buying of vehicles and footwear, all of that kind of stuff stopped. People weren't buying. But on the flip side, people were spending more things on furniture, appliances, housing, water, electricity, gas, other fuels. So this obviously is showing that the cost of living is getting much higher. However, the luxury side of life is going down.
Indeed, overall, we estimate that the expenditure by the households decreased by 0.3%. As you mentioned, it's a bit of a mixed bag with a drop in the clothing and the footwear, the transport. But we saw increases of furniture. Actually, out of the categories we measure, furniture increased by the most, just under 2%. We also saw an increase in the restaurants and foods. And in a way, it's a bit counterintuitive to think that if the cost of living goes up, why would the restaurant industry be doing well? But remember, the first quarter of the year is a very lucrative time for our tourism industry. So restaurants might be doing very well, not because of South Africans visiting the restaurants, but the large influx of tourists that might be boosting that sector.
Yeah, so it also just shows you the impact of tourism, even into things like going out for meals and that kind of sector. So it'll be interesting to see how that balances out coming into the second quarter, because by then we should start seeing a clearer picture on that one. But weaker manufacturing, and this is a great worry, because manufacturing, mining, construction, these industries really did contribute to the negativity, because these are massive industries. Perhaps you can break it down for us in these sectors. This also included vehicle manufacturing going down.
Yeah, quite right. Manufacturing contracted by 0.2, or contributed 0.2% on the negative side to the economy, because they contracted by about 1.5%. That was mostly due to a reduction in the production of motor vehicles, motor vehicle accessories, those types of things, as well as basic iron and steel. And we saw that then flow through to the rest of the economy. Gross fixed capital formation was also negative, mostly due to reduction in capital formation in machinery equipment and transport equipment. Because if we didn't produce it, and we saw on the import side, we didn't really import it, that's why it doesn't reflect in the capital formation. Similarly, the mining industry subtracted to economic growth, although very small, 0.1 of a percentage point. That was due to a reduction of 2.3%, and that was lower production in items such as the PGMs, gold and coal.
I want to just go back a little bit more to when we spoke about the consumer and how the consumer feels about this, as well as massive industries as well, because I imagine that pre-election uncertainty must have played a role, because you could see that people were a little bit nervous before the elections, and perhaps we get an idea of how people and industries are feeling now, after we've obviously seen the results. But now is it a hold on and wait and see to see how this all pans out? So in other words, what I'm asking you is the elections, how have they played a role in all of this?
It's an interesting question, but it's something that Stats SA doesn't measure. We tend to ask businesses all about their finances and their production and not include questions around the sentiment. So when a company decides to, or they report lower turnover or lower investment, we don't go as far as asking them, well, why don't you invest? Or why was your turnover lower? There are other surveys outside of Stats SA that is more than likely better placed than ourselves to speculate on the extent to what the elections and potential certainty or uncertainty had to do on the business environment, as well as looking forward. I guess at the moment, anybody's guess is a good one because we don't really know what's going to happen.
I kind of knew you would answer it that way, but I was just taking a chance. I know you're here to talk about the actual numbers and not to sort of speculate what's behind them. So thanks, Joe, for clearing that up for me. But let's perhaps look ahead now, because that's where we're at. And so far, we've seen an improvement on this availability of electricity, as we've said, decreased load shedding. I think we're heading into about 70 days. I'm not sure how long it's been. But looking forward, obviously the predictions are there as to what the second quarter is going to look like. Perhaps you can give us a glimpse into that.
The Stat SA monthly surveys that basically inform the quarterly GDP, the estimates for April will only start coming in a little bit later this month in June. So I don't have any hard facts yet on what's happening in April, let alone the other 2 months. But if we look at some of the indices from research institutions, universities, purchase managers indexes and things like that, there still seems to be quite a sideways growth in the economy rather than a strong upsurge. On agriculture, weather is very unpredictable, but as I think I mentioned earlier, because of the drought conditions we had in certain parts of the country, it might be that the second quarter maize does not give us a very strong agriculture, especially coming off this very high base effect that we now reported to 13% in the first quarter. So Q2 for agriculture might be less strong than what we saw in Q1, but we'll have to wait and see how the rest of the industries perform.
All right, Joe, let's leave it there. Thanks so much for talking to us about these numbers and looking a bit deeper into them. Joe de Beer, Deputy Director General of Economic Statistics at Stats SA, basically breaking down each of the sectors, having a look at those figures that were released yesterday and which industries did well and which industries didn't do too well. Thanks again, Joe.